After that, we got Saw X last October. I have been wanting to do a video about the future of the franchise. Because what we got with Saw X was kind of a prequel, but also a sequel. Because it took place after Saw 1 and before Saw 2. So I wanted to discuss where the Saw franchise might be going next. I've talked about Saw X before and I really like the direction they took. And we are getting a Saw 11 this September. One thing that I think they will do is to keep the focus on John Kramer. Because every time they switched focus, the fans didn't appreciate it. Every Saw movie that he isn't in, or where he isn't the focus, tends to be the least liked movie in the franchise by fans. And I know he died in 3, but they still managed to have him as the focus after he died. It was basically only in Jigsaw and Spiral where he wasn't that much of a focus. So I think they will keep that focus on him in this upcoming sequel. The challenge would just be how. I know he survived Saw X, but it would be kind of hard to explain how many things happened between 1 and 2. I mean Saw 1 and 2. Because if you do a straight sequel to Saw X, it would have to take place before Saw 2. And I don't think it went like several years or many years in the timeline between Saw 1 and 2. But who knows, they might have another story that takes place during that time. And spoilers, who knows, they did introduce Hoffman back again, so maybe the movie will be more focused on him. But then again, we all know, or at least fans know, what Hoffman is, who he is, and his background and why he did what he did. But I do think they have a plan with him, otherwise they wouldn't have introduced him in Saw X again. Another thing that might be interesting is to focus it on Amanda.
Tell me the first thing you remember.
I woke up. All I could taste was blood and metal.
She is a pretty interesting character, and she is after all John Kramer's right hand. It would be interesting to see how her psychology allowed her to become John Kramer's accomplice. Shawnee Smith does a great job with the character so far. She was great in Saw X too. And that's where the issue is. You have to kind of focus on those 3 characters. Those are the fan favorite characters. John Kramer, Amanda Young, and Mark Hoffman. If you make a mistake like Jigsaw did, the fans won't turn up. Where you just introduce a character that was not presented before and there was no time spent on the character before he was presented as John Kramer's new apprentice. You kinda have to have a character that we were presented to and that we care about. That would potentially take on the legacy of Jigsaw. Because I don't want to go back to the time where the Saw movies were just basically focused on the traps. It's just not that interesting to me. Because most of the Saw franchise just went with the trap gimmick. And I don't really get invested if you're going to do a Saw movie again where there's trap after trap after trap. I have nothing against the traps themselves, but you kinda have to have stakes when putting people or the characters in those traps. And for the most part, the Saw franchise just put paper-thin characters in those traps, so you just didn't care what happened to them. That's what I liked about Saw X so much. The characters in that movie were well written, and even if you didn't like some of them, because most of them were villains and awful people, you did care in a more negative way, like you wanted to make them suffer, you wanted to see them suffer. That's still a very good way to write characters. So another thing I would like to see in the next movie is to put characters we care about in those traps. It makes it much better. Maybe do a movie from the perspective of a character that's put in those traps. It wouldn't hurt to go back to telling a character-driven story like the first movie. Dr. Gordon and Adam, they were quite interesting characters, especially Dr. Gordon. Sure, they were not that well acted characters, but they were well written. The first movie was focused on Dr. Gordon and his family, at least for the second part of the movie. But you also got dialogue exchanges between the two main characters that showed and revealed some information about them. You also got to see how they got there and what they did to get there. At least what they did that Jigsaw or John Kramer felt was wrong. Compare that to the latter entries in the franchise, where you just get a bunch of one-dimensional characters. And that brings me to another thing that I felt was bad in many of the Saw movies. The overall story was just too messy. Throughout the 7 original movies, you kind of had to believe a lot of things that don't make sense, that would have to be a too big coincidence for it to happen the way it did. The overall story was too incredible to be credible. You would have to put away any understanding of time, logistics, or logic in any way for it to make sense, for it all to be put together and make sense in the scale it was presented. That was basically the biggest issue with the original Saw movies. That and the very badly written characters. Saw X did have some problems with it, but not to the extent that the original franchise had, or I mean the movies from 1 to 7 or 8. Many of the fans do praise it for its story, but it is a bit convoluted, and if you go and look at it from the beginning to end, some things just don't make sense. And that is an issue that the franchise has had from at least 3 or 4. Saw 3 is where John Kramer dies, and you have to kind of make up some things for him not being there. And I think many of the things that they tried just didn't work, didn't make sense. When you look at them, they just fall apart from movie to movie. By the time that Saw 7 came out, you kind of lost interest in the whole story. So what I would advise them to do is to minimize the more far-fetched story beats and story elements. Another thing I would like to see is bringing back James Wan or Leigh Whannell. James Wan directed the first movie, and Leigh Whannell was the screenwriter for the first 3 movies. It would be great to have either of them back because both went on and had some good careers after the Saw franchise. The dream would be to have Wan direct and Leigh Whannell write the screenplay. But both of them are directors now, and Leigh Whannell likes to both write and direct his own projects, like he did with Upgrade and Invisible Man. And James Wan went on to making some very big budget movies like Aquaman and the Fast and the Furious franchise, an entry in the Fast and the Furious franchise. But he does occasionally go back to some smaller horror projects. But he does have his own production company now, and he's working with Blumhouse, together with Blumhouse, so I think he's busy. And Leigh Whannell is remaking The Wolfman. That is coming out this October. But it would be a dream to have either of them back to the franchise. And those were my thoughts on what I want to see in a new Saw movie that is coming this September. What would you want to see in the new Saw movie? Let me know in the comments. And if you liked this video, please like, share and subscribe. This has been Boogeyman Cinema. Thank you for watching.